Hello and welcome to the Stack Magazine's podcast. My name is Stephen Watson and I run Stack, the magazine club that delivers a different independent publication to your door every month. In this episode, I'm speaking with Andy Crysell, one of the editors of No Way Back, the music magazine that connects readers with scenes, artists and innovators from decades ago, as it says, learning from, not longing for, the past. It is a really interesting project that combines its archival content with this vivid sense of life and passion. So, Andy, first of all, thank you very much for making time to talk about it.
Thank you, Steve. Nice to be here.
And so, like, as I say, I think like a really important part of this is you're looking at stuff that happened decades ago, but it feels very immediate and of the moment. Like, how did you come to make this? It's such a strange editorial product.
Yeah, it is. It was an interesting process. I mean, I guess to go back to the very beginning of it, the beginning of it was around about 2023, the start of 23. I had just sold and left my agency that I've been running for about 16 years. I had time on my hands. I was working out what I was going to do next, and this is one of the things that sort of bubbled to the surface. I spent a lot of time just going down some wormholes, looking at old editorial from different kinds of magazines in around music and subculture. Frankly, that's something I've always done, but now I had a lot more time to do it. And I started to crystallize an idea in my head about what would it mean to bring this material back again. It felt like it deserved to be resurfaced. It's really hard to find this stuff. I think there's a sort of, maybe we'll talk about this a little bit more later in, but a bit of a sort of generational appeal to it as well. It appeals to people who were there first time around. It appeals to other people for different reasons. I started talking to Mark Maddox, who is the co-founder of No Way Back. We have some overlapping paths in the distance in terms of how we both worked in around sort of music magazines and so forth, and we hatched up a plan to bring it together as a publication. So we had issue 1 that came out last year. Issue 2, which you've just received a copy of, is out now. It's winging its way to people who've ordered direct from us. It's winging its way to lots of interesting bookstores, record stores, and so on around the world.
Well, I really appreciate you getting this one to me in time for us talking, because so I saw issue 1 and really liked it. I feel like issue 2 is like sort of a step forward in sort of like in the project. We can get to details of that in a bit, but so you just alluded to like sort of your background in like music. So like, what was that?
Yeah, so I had about 20 years running agencies, but go back before that, back to the dim and distant 1990s. And the first thing I did was I wrote for magazines, not necessarily through design in terms of wanting to be a journalist. I just wanted to be involved in club culture. Club culture kind of exploded in London. It was my gateway into what felt like a whole bunch of different opportunities. I was doing a bunch of different things in club culture, but the bit that stuck was writing for magazines. And I spent about 10 years writing for The Face, ID, NME, DJ, Music, etc., etc. I guess you could maybe call it the last golden age of the first wave of mags, when you'd pop down to Smith's and so on. It was a great time. You didn't earn a lot of money being a music journalist, but you got to travel a lot. You got to go to some interesting places and meet some interesting people. And I think you learn a lot, not just about how to write, but other stuff that was really useful to me in terms of then running agencies. Just, maybe how you join dots between culture, between people, between different areas of business and so on.
So when you and Mark first started talking, so Mark was also a music journalist back in the 90s.
He was more on the business side. So he was more on the business publishing side at Blues and Soul, and then at the DMC organization. And then we were both working on .coms in parallel, early 2000s. Then we both launched my first agency and his agency. We're both in that kind of, loosely youth culture meets music meets digital media space. So yeah, a lot of parallels. Although this is the first time we've actually worked on a proper project together, rather than just had a chat down the pub and talked about things that we could do.
Hey, everything starts with a chat down the pub, right?
It does indeed. It does.
So when the two of you first started talking about this thing that would become No Way Back, was it always going to be you going and sourcing stories from the music press from years gone by?
Correct. I mean, when we think of No Way Back as a brand, the brand as a whole is a bit broad than that. It's going to be about how we tell stories about the past, less well told stories about the past in interesting, creative, intentional ways. And that could be about curating and bringing back old material, or it could be about new ways to tell those stories. But in terms of the current series, the one that you've got issue 2 of, that is very much about curating material from the past. So searching back through all kinds of different sources online and offline across all sorts of different magazines and trying to bring together what feels like an interesting blend of material. And I think some of the things that are really interesting for me there, I love the fact that these people who were writing these stories and taking these pictures, it really was kind of first draft of history stuff. They didn't have the foggiest idea that people would still be talking about graffiti and break dancing and hip hop and disco almost 50 years later. So as much as there is a place for all the sort of theorising and canonisation that's come afterwards, there's also something quite nice about this, just people speaking about what they're seeing in front of them. We hope that comes across in the title.
Well, 100%. I mean, look, it certainly comes across in the name No Way Back. I suppose there's a danger with a project like this that it could sort of slide into nostalgia. It could get
Absolutely.
like the rose-tinted spectacles on.
Absolutely.
And there's something about the way that you approach it that means that you kind of don't do that. So what's the thing, do you think, that stops that from happening?
Yeah, I mean, we were really, really mindful of that from the beginning, hence coming up with the line, learning from, not longing for the past. I mean, I guess, broadly speaking, nostalgia is massive these days. You know, nostalgia has become this huge industry across everything from movie franchises to fashion to gaming to how advertising portrays things. People love looking back, and there's nothing inherently wrong about that. There's a lot of amazing stuff to look back at, but I suppose there is a bit of a fine line there, and it can get quite toxic. You can almost get into this place where, before you know it, people are saying, back in my day things were better. There was a golden age, and even you get to the extreme. You know, if you're unfortunate enough to visit Facebook, you'll see on there people will post a picture of a part of their town from 30 years ago, and there'll be loads of horrible comments about how much better it was back there. And it's getting, you're getting into reform territory quite soon, I think. But nonetheless, there's lots of positives that can come from looking back as well. And this is about what you can learn from it. So, it's about what stories can we bring through that can help shape where culture, subculture, creativity goes next. And I think there's a lot of things to unpack in that, really. I mean, I guess the obvious thing is the aesthetics of the past is interesting. There's lovely things to look at: logos, colorways, fonts, design layouts. And you can sort of see how all of this stuff has shown up in advertising and more commercial areas of retail. So that's interesting. But I don't think it's just about the aesthetics of the past. It's kind of about infrastructure and systems and how people made stuff happen back then. And maybe mistakes as well, things that went wrong. But it's what can we take from that? And for me, that is why this project is hopefully kind of cross-generational. Yes, we know there's going to be a bunch of people of a certain age who are going to love looking back at the things that they're involved with, but there's certainly a younger audience who are really into it, just for what they can take from it and what they can take on their own journeys.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier, I said, I feel like this second issue is that kind of, it feels like doesn't just feel like the second issue, it feels like a sort of development of the project. And I think a part of that is, so you've got a line in the introduction that says, everyone here is busy making something new, unaware they're shaping history, which we'll still be talking about decades later. That immediacy is what these pages capture. The canonization and post-rationalization stay on hold. And I was like, yeah, that was the thing that in the first one, that's what stopped it from being like nostalgia. It's that sense of immediacy and we don't really know what this is yet, but here's a thing we've just come across.
Yeah. And it's funny, when you read through it, there's all kinds of odd references that would have made sense, but don't make sense now. So in the new one, there's a big story about the birth of house music, and there's a reference in it to life after go-go. And go-go was briefly a popular dance music, but it's so amazing because it's such a footnote now. But at that moment in time, they were kind of pondering what on earth would life be like after go-go music. So you get all of these kind of kind of weird little things that, made sense in that moment, but you wouldn't have got through the sort of post-rationalization. So yeah, with every article, we have a little bit of extra commentary we add to it, but we try and make sure that the added commentary doesn't kind of outweigh the initial hit you get from seeing the piece as it was.
And so sometimes for that bit of added commentary, you'll have like an interview with, say, like the editor of the magazine or like the photographer to the pictures. And sometimes it's like just you almost doing like an old fashioned box out, like kind of So when you're like deciding what to do with that, like how do you decide like, oh, actually, this piece needs an interview with the editor?
Yeah, good question. I'm not sure there was a particular design to that. I think it's about flow, isn't it, really, with print media? You start to look at what it's looking like, where could there be a little bit more context that you could add? You couldn't, if you did it around every piece, it would suddenly get very long and a bit slow moving. So I guess it's the pieces where we felt there was some added value in terms of having a bit of an extra commentary, probably accessibility as well. Who can we actually get access to? When you're going so far back in time, that created all manner of challenges in terms of accessing people, a lot of challenges around rights as well. Who owns the rights to things? But I think overall it's probably around flow, just trying to make something that feels like it moves at the correct kind of pace. And we were kind of mindful that we wanted it to be a title that rewarded further exploration, even if that is at the cost of a little bit of immediacy. Probably, there are probably titles out there that have a more immediate sort of shelf appeal, if you know what I mean. But we wanted something that kind of really warranted you going back in and looking again and digging deeper and just kind of really thinking about what was on the page.
Okay, so thinking about what's on the page, the first story in this issue seems like sort of a key. It seems like kind of like the key to the whole project. So maybe just like for anyone who's not seen it, obviously most people have not seen it, tell us like what that story is and why is that at the start of this one?
Sure. So it's a story from a magazine called Collusion that ran for, I think, only 4 or 5 issues in the early 80s. It was founded by various people. The best known is a guy called David Toop, who is an academic, a music maker. He's written some brilliant books about music and used to write for magazines way back in the day. And it was a magazine that was trying to look at music quite differently, really. I guess, back when talking about having a diverse music taste, an eclectic music taste, which is one of those slightly horrible terms, I think, these days, a bit overused. But back then, everyone really was staying in their lane. It was the first title that was, it was one of the first titles that was trying to bring a lot of different components together. There was an article in there called Behind the Groove, which was this very, very epic, and apparently there's a much longer version that didn't actually make it into the magazine, exploration of New York disco, kind of what was at the very end of the disco wave and, almost prototype house music emerging. Now, this piece is quite important to me, really, because long before, I'd never seen Collusion magazine until we worked on this issue, but I had a photocopy of that article way back in the 90s. It was kind of pre-internet. It was the only way you could kind of dive into this world of clubs like The Loft and the Paradise Garage and people like Walter Gibbons and David Mancuso and Larry Levan. I was given a copy by someone a bit more senior at magazine, and it sat there by my desk. First when I had a typewriter, and then when I had my first Mac. And it was kind of like a bit like a Bible, really. It was a really important script, and there were photocopies of this thing circulating amongst DJs and producers and journalists. There was a guy selling them at Camden Market. So it had an amazing afterlife. The magazine itself, I think they only printed about 3,000 or 4,000 copies, but it then sort of had this afterlife. So it felt quite exciting for me to all those years after to bring it back again and actually to see the copy. I'd never seen it in situ in Collusion, which is a brilliantly of its time title as well. So yeah, it felt like a really nice piece to open with, and probably, as you say, quite emblematic of what we're trying to do with the No Way Back project.
Yeah. And I mean, so just like kind of a casual glance at the magazine. So I was kind of like flipping through before I started really reading. And there's this magazine, Collusion. Yeah, never heard of that. And then you've got like, kind of The Face and like Rolling Stone and all that. So like, I guess that was like a little bit of a kind of alert at the start of like, okay, this must be a really important story for some reason. And then like, as it unfolds and you kind of like, I mean, again, I had never like heard of it or come across it. And it seems to me that like it shows that there's something important about print to this whole project because, you know, like you say, you had like a photocopied like version of this that like back then that was how you would have got that information because like you couldn't access it otherwise. And it seems like now, like obviously, I mean, I just Googled it earlier and like there's, you know, several versions on the internet and like, you know,
Yeah.
we can all access everything that we want, but
Yeah.
then that becomes the problem. And so no way back becomes this way of using print to just like select the interesting bits and put them in front of people. So like when you're making this as like a print object, what are the things that you're trying to do with it? Like, why isn't this, for example, like a podcast or like a YouTube channel or something?
Yeah, I mean, I think No Way Back, I use the word again, as a brand, we're definitely interested in exploring all kinds of different mediums and platforms, but print um, and kind of using print in interesting ways is going to remain very key. And certainly it is what this particular part of No Way Back is all about. I think one of the important things for me is in this age of platforms and algorithms, as we keep hearing, everything gets kind of flattened and everything is presented all at once. And I suppose there's some advantages that everyone has access to everything, as you said. But what we lose is kind of context, the sequential order. And when you think about subculture, it happened in a particular order for a particular reason. You know, there are reasons, political, social, environmental, why one thing happened after another. So I think print is really, really good at bringing that kind of context back. It becomes a more intentional way of reading. I think, as gets talked about quite a lot, the tactile nature of print as well just forms a very different relationship with the material that's in front of you. So all of that is really, really important, I guess. And, you know, we hear so much about this, I guess, you know, people talking about a rebirth of print, and that's very exciting. I mean, I think from my point of view, there is still quite a lot that needs to be done in the infrastructure of print media. It's easy for people to stand on the sidelines going, hey, print is back. But anyone doing it realizes that there are some really challenging aspects to it. And I suppose a concern there is you don't want print media to be just something that only people that can afford to do projects that aren't hugely profitable can do, because that then suddenly limits access to making print media to a certain kind of person can do it and other people can't do it. So it's lovely that people are talking about print being back, and there are clearly a lot of interesting titles out there, but it feels there's quite a lot to be done in terms of infrastructural type stuff.
Sounds like you've got some war stories to share there. What are the things that you've come across that have been particularly difficult?
I won't get into specifics, but it's, you know, you are going back in time in certain ways with certain aspects of bringing a magazine together. Yeah, I think there is. Yeah, I without getting into specifics, you become aware that it's a challenge really, and you know, I guess you don't want this next wave of print media to just feel like a lot of hobbyists, you know, doing these kind of quite niche things and maybe running out of steam after 2 or 3 issues. So I'm really interested in terms of how we can get to kind of systems and processes that allow more people to make print media, and also ultimately makes them raises the profitability of running them as well.
Mm-hmm. And do you see a way through to doing that? Because I mean, look, I'm sort of, you know, reading between the lines. I think we're talking about distribution, and the fact is that for you to make a magazine now and like get it out in front of people in shops is, you know, you're making like a 21st century product that's operating in like a 20th century system. The like, you know, it used to make sense to send out thousands of copies of
Yeah,
magazines because you're selling advertising in there. And so if you
for
only
sure.
sold 40% of them, that still works. Whereas, you know, you're making this beautiful print object. And I imagine you probably need to sell like the copies of it to make them enough money to do another one. So, I mean,
Yeah.
do you sort of see a way through to that more functional future?
I do. I think maybe the infrastructure is lagging behind the enthusiasm for print media, but as long as there is enthusiasm for it, and I guess as long as people are making it and people are picking these copies up and talking about it, there's going to be moves made by people to improve the system. So I think it will come, but there's definitely work to be done. I guess it's just, I find it quite intriguing when you see so many people talking about how print is back, but there may be people who aren't actually making print. And I love the idea that it's back, and it's all part, I suppose, of this return to IRL and people looking for substance and moving offline. And this is all really good, wholesome stuff. But we want to make sure that it's not just limited to those who can, who are in a privileged enough place to run projects which aren't going to be hugely profitable. So that's the challenge, I think, for the industry.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so thinking specifically about the magazine and I'm thinking about the way it looks. So I said before that it's quite an unusual publishing product because you're taking stuff that has been published in other places, all with its own character and kind of, I guess, sort of like tone of voice and like coming from different decades. I mean, like this is like really different stuff.
Yeah.
And you have to present all of that within a system that allows it all to sit alongside each other. So it feels like the design is doing a job in a way of like providing a sort of neutrality of just like, look, here you go, here's this information, and you can go from one story to the next without it kind of jarring and like clashing. I think you're not the designer, right?
No, two very good guys called Dan and Lee were brought on board as the designers and have done a fantastic job. Yeah, I guess if I go back to the very beginnings of me thinking about Now We're Back, I think the first version I had in my head was a much more kind of zine-y, pamphlet-y version where probably we were just going to run the copy from the original articles and that was it. Much more lo-fi. I'm very glad we moved away from that. We came to this place where we're trying to combine running the copy, so it's a nice readable version, but then running a lot of the original material as well. So you see it in situ, and I think that brings all of these sort of layers and different sort of textures to the title. And to your point, yeah, these things are wildly different in terms, and I thought about this early on, and there's no way we could have standardized everything. If a certain publication puts speech marks around album titles and another one doesn't, leave it as is, all of that kind of stuff. Some of them are a bit more amateurish. There are definitely some typos in there, but again, we thought we'd just sort of leave that stuff in. If there was something that is clearly a bit of an error, generally we leave it in. Sometimes we might put a footnote to explain that actually that isn't correct, but we didn't want to fiddle with it too much. We thought it was much better you see it as is. And I suppose your point, I don't know if it is a nice smooth flow or if it's actually quite kind of jarring, but in an appealing way. I'm not sure. I guess it's down to sort of in the eye of the beholder in a way, but it certainly sort of jumps through some pretty dramatic style shifts as it goes.
Yeah. No, well, personally, I find it. I feel like it feels like a sort of a research piece because you're being presented with all of these texts, and you have like for when it's actually the text from the magazine, you've got super simple like single column layout. And then when you have like your like kind of your contextual stuff, you switch to like sort of like a 2-column layout, and so it could give in like a little bit of difference. But then it means that when I get to those like the reproductions of the actual article, you almost read it again, like because you're like,
indeed.
seeing the way that was presented like the first time around. Were you tempted to do any more like, so you've got like there are footnotes in there, as you say, where you give like a little bit more context? Were you tempted to like throw in some pull quotes or something, or like other things to kind of like guide the reader's eye, or did you want to have that like total distance from it?
I think not. I think we wanted to keep it relatively stripped back, and I think Lee and Dan certainly helped give guidance there on that. But yeah, it does feel quite raw, and I think it does feel a little bit like a research item, a research artifact as well. So no, I think any more contextualization, anything else like that, probably would have sort of defeated the object of the project. Yeah, so I think I feel we got that balance about right. There's not a lot else in there. There's we got some Spotify playlists to go with each of the articles as well. So there's a sort of a digital component to it. But it's this. I think this layering is really, really important. And there is some degree of flow in the editorial, but it's also moves around a little bit. You know, the start date and end date of both of the issues is relatively arbitrary. Um, as we move out through issues, we'll probably test the limits in terms of what kind of musics and stuff outside of music can we start to cover. I mean, the No Way Back project as a whole definitely has aspirations to, even though I reckon music will still be a really strong center of gravity, there are a lot of other topics that we think are really interesting that we can revisit and tell stories about, things that are, you know, either less told, untold, and resurface things in interesting ways.
Totally, yeah, yeah. So you brought the dates in. So your first issue ran 1977 to 1989. This one's 1979 to 1997. Do you like? Do you feel like, is this a project that can go into the 2000s that can, so I'm thinking like roughly as like, you know, the 2000s as being like, this is when like the internet started. And so then, you know, kind of anything that's been published then is like on the internet. Is that a problem with this, or do you think you can also run through into the internet era?
I think we can. We've talked about this and we've got ideas. There's certainly sort of cultural hotbeds and scenes that we can cover. I think it's going to create some interesting challenges in terms of where the material comes from. We're in that sort of halcyon space at the moment of, you know, the smash hits of this world and the Village Voices of this world, where it was sort of the only place to find out about this stuff, bar sort of fanzines as well. We're going to have to think about the material and where we get it from. But yeah, you know, there's a lot of more recent history that we haven't got to yet. We haven't really got a set day and ahead of what's our cutoff point where things could be described as current. So I think we've got a lot more room to go. We've got the third issue is coming together. It's sitting there in a spreadsheet. I'd say we're probably, I don't know, 70% of the way there in terms of what's going to be in it. We've got one of the big challenges is actually getting the permissions and the copyrights and that sort of thing. And we've got some offshoot projects we're working on as well, playing with different types of print media to tell different sorts of story. So yeah, I think there's a lot more we can do, but I think you're right. I think when we get into the digital age, the social age, where the stories were told, who were the narrators of the stories is going to get interesting in terms of how we deal with that.
Yeah. So you've mentioned a couple of times like the process of going to the publishers. What has their response been like?
Generally positive. No one's been negative at all. And you know, just to rewind a little bit, it's really important to us for this project to be taken seriously, that we are crediting the right people, we are paying people. We don't have a huge budget, but we pay people for the use of the material. Finding who has the permission is one of the hardest things. Quite a few of the titles that we're running material from don't exist anymore, so people aren't quite sure who owns the rights to it. And even when you do get in touch with the right people, frankly, they weren't necessarily that big on contracts back then. So, you know, is it owned by the writer? Is it owned by the print media? So we are doing our best. It's quite time consuming. Finding material is relatively hard. Getting the copyright signed and sealed is definitely harder still, but it's important for us to make the effort to explore that side of it and make sure we're crediting the right people and so on.
Yeah. Okay, look. So I coming to the end of all of this, I was thinking like, kind of, what is it that makes this magazine so special? I think that it's first of all, it's like that information being surfaced from places that it would be difficult to find that stuff. I think it's the fact that it's all coming out of these kind of like subcultures and like, you know, these little sort of like moments where something kind of crystallizes and comes together. But then it's sort of important then that like these things did get big as well. So you mentioned the Chicago House story earlier, and in that there's a line about like Frankie Knuckles is sitting in the corner like working on like an, and it's like, that's an amazing little scene, which is made all the more amazing for the fact that like now Frankie Knuckles is like amazingly famous, and you're like, wow, so he was just sitting in the corner doing that, like, and it sort of feels like maybe this is like me as an old man talking now, but like it feels like because culture works in a slightly different way now, where everything like because everything is atomized and everyone's like, you know, there are so many subcultures that just stay as subcultures. Or like, you know, my algorithm's showing me something different to your algorithm. So, the fact of these magazines, like, The Face in its day, was bringing all of this stuff together in one place. So everyone who read The Face was seeing the same thing. Do you think that you'll be able to, will there be a no way back in the future that's looking at our time now? Or has culture moved so completely differently that just won't be possible anymore?
I mean, I think there'll be challenges, and to your point, there will be differences. I think maybe one thing to say is, first of all, I don't think necessarily subculture is that clear until you start to look back on it, and then you start to see
No.
things that maybe weren't so apparent in the moment, and maybe scenes that felt lost in with lots of other things will start to become a little bit more enduring. So I think that's an important consideration. But yeah, I suppose we're in a place now where everything's either super niche and maybe quite transient, or it's the other end. It's a sort of, it's there is this sort of the Taylor Swifts of this world, just this huge, great industry that just chugs along and earns billions and billions of pounds. Things like, sort of house music and hip hop culture were sort of in the middle of these two extremes, really, weren't they? So I think that middle is maybe not quite as apparent as it was. I guess as long as there's still things going on, there'll be stories to be told, but the way we tell the stories may well have to change to reflect the fact that there weren't necessarily quite such cohesive centers of gravity as there were with things like techno and hip hop and house music and so on.
Well, look, I mean, I'm really interested by like all the ideas of these other bits of No Way Back and other sort of iterations of it. So obviously looking forward to seeing issue 3, but also just looking forward to seeing the different ways that you go with this project. I think it's great.
Nice one. Thank you, Steve.
Cheers, Andy.